And what that boils down to in, whoops, there we go, in your garden is what I'm going to talk about today. So first, we have to, sorry, there are some of my scientists, I believe that's in Australia. First, we have to let go of our assumptions, okay? There are all these things that we know about plants and soil and life, and we need to let go of, you know, the morning's frustrations, the day's frustrations, whatever, shake it off and realign ourselves to think in systems. You know, we talk about systems, but really thinking in systems takes some doing, it takes some getting used to. So we have planetary systems, obviously, like the thermals, the very high air currents. The reason we get polar vortices now is our thermals were very stable for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And we don't have enough temperature difference now between the equator and the poles. And so we get these thermals sweeping down across the country and bringing us some really nasty weather surprises. So that's one of our planetary systems. We have regional systems, so we know that Kansas is semi-arid, that arid area is actually moving further east every year. Our watershed, and it gets to Missouri, and Missouri has more springs, I believe, than any other state in the country. So that arid wind comes in and picks up moisture in Missouri, and it really changes what's happening in terms of weather. Our greater watershed goes from the Rockies to the Appalachians, comes down the rivers, down into the Mississippi, and empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And we have local systems. So, you know, a couple of weeks ago when we had 64 degrees in the afternoon and it went down to 10 degrees at night. We have microsystems. You may hear designers talk about microclimates where a plant likes one part of your yard and not another. It could be the amount of daylight, it could be the amount of water it's getting, or it could be something in the soil, which is what we'll be talking about. And we know that we have changed these things because we can see it. You know, we're trying not to go over 2 degrees centigrade of warming in average temperatures around the globe. And we have 71 countries now, or counties, sorry, 71 counties in the US that have exceeded 2 degrees warming already. So you kind of expect that to happen, say in Los Angeles, this big red blob, and out into Death Valley. But here's Santa Barbara, you know, over an hour up the coast, and it's also seeing really increased temperatures. And this big blob that's over Colorado, this is the Rockies. This is why we're getting the pine beetles that lay the nematodes under the bark of the tree, and the tree ends up with its whole vascular system filled. And please don't use nematicides. 95% of nematodes are good, but this is how we've disturbed the system. And so we're seeing this increase in temperatures in places that we don't necessarily expect to see it. And one of the things that's happening now that's really making the feedback loop go faster is when our soils are drying out. So California is in a drought that is the biggest drought in 1,200 years. So the soil is drying out and is reflecting heat back into the atmosphere and getting captured by the greenhouse gases. So it's speeding up that feedback loop. And that's one of the real dangers. So anything you do in your garden is going to affect the system. And it might be hard to think of it that way. And certainly with what you do in your yard may not be, you may not think of it as making a big difference, but I just saw Jonathan Lundgren from Ecdysis Foundation or Blue Dasher Farm. He's an entomologist, worked for the USDA until the USDA got very unhappy about the fact that he was talking about things like farm chemicals. He's an entomologist. He's only supposed to talk about insects, not farm chemicals. What he told us is one seed, so one kernel of corn that you would use for seed, if it's treated with neonics before you plant it, it will kill 164,000 bees. Treating seed with neonics is now the industry standard. So unless you are getting organic seed that does not have a treatment on it, and it may not list the neonic, it may list an adjutant. The adjutant can actually be more toxic than the pesticide itself. So if you're planting seeds and you want to have bees further than next year, we really want to use organic seed. We're killing about 150% of our bee population every year, which clearly cannot go on. So we're not only killing all the bees that we have at the beginning of the season, but about half of the new ones as well. So how long can that go on?
Hilary, real quick, we have a question in the chat. Where do we get organic seed?
It takes a little bit of digging, and as people start to make this realization, it'll get harder to find. We have some local people who are raising seed. So I think Buffalo Seed is a local one, local farmers. I think Ursa and Vixen is another local grower. Is Johnny's seed organic? I would Google organic seed, but also look at local growers and ask them questions. You have the right to know where everything you're buying comes from. And you really need to know if it's been treated with neonics. So we got there because when we look at a natural system, we tend to study it one piece at a time, right? So we look at, oh, we've got a pest problem. And instead of looking at that as a symptom, we look at that as being the problem. So then we come up with this neonicotinoid, the imidacloprid or one of the others, and we develop that as a way of dealing with the pest instead of looking at where the problem came from. We'll get to where the problem comes from. So we've operated from this idea that we can affect one part of the system without affecting the whole. Humans like to be very linear. We like sequence and we like hierarchy, but that's really a handicap when you're looking at natural systems. So here's the basic system that was here in this region before large-scale tillage agriculture, before large-scale development, before we had our road systems and all the rest. So we had grasses, we had, an ocean of grasslands. We had very deep soils. We had, lots of organic matter in the soils. We had forests, we had wetlands, we had large ruminant animals moving through our landscape on a regular basis. We had birds and insects. It was all powered by original solar power. And all of that regulated the rain system. And so we had the rain system that we needed for the things that grew and evolved here. And it was all a very happy system. We had a good predator-prey system going as well. And all of that was balanced. And, there are all kinds of ebb and flow in a natural system. And so we talk about the balance of the nature, but that's not a static thing. It's always got ebb and flow to it. It goes between tipping points, extremes. So if you don't get as much rain one year, you don't get as much greenery, you don't have as many deer. You get a whole lot of rain, you get a whole lot of greenery, you have a whole lot of bunny rabbits. In a drought year, it may not seem like you have fewer rabbits because they're all aimed at your garden. But believe it or not, there really are fewer rabbits. And by the way, this guy over here, the ruminant animal, evolved to eat crappy grass and improve the soil by leaving organic matter and microbes behind it. So whether it's bison or deer or the cow, they were never meant to eat corn and soy. That's what we do in a CAFO, a combined animal feeding operation. That's really unhealthy for the animal. It's unhealthy for us. It causes all kinds of environmental degradation. CAFOs are a mess. That doesn't mean that the cow is bad. It means that the CAFO is bad. So, and that's combined animal feeding operation. So, and by the way, just because the cow walked across the ground once doesn't mean it's solved. These were animals that roamed through this area. The predator-prey relationship kept animals moving, so there wasn't overgrazing. They'd eat down so far, they'd move on, and it all worked very well as a system. So when you're thinking about your garden and you're deciding on things that you need to do for your garden, think about that system. What things are still in place in your yard? What things are not? What things are you taking the place of? And what things do you need to replace into this system to have healthy working soil? And by the way, when I'm talking, it's never my intention to demonize farmers. The basics in farming are still being taught as this extractive system. So while we do now finally have a regenerative ag program at Mizzou, it's just getting going, but farmers are doing what they were taught to do, what the extension agents have told them to do. The extension agents did what they were taught was the right thing to do. I mentioned Jonathan Lundgren a few minutes before. Jonathan was working at USDA. He believed everything that he had learned in school. And it was only when he got out in the field and he was actually going around and looking at things that he saw the damage that was happening. And for a lot of farmers, they're seeing the damage not only to their land, but that they can't support themselves on the land anymore. If you have less than 5,000 acres, at least one person on the farm has to have a day job. Frequently, it's several people on the land with a day job. And so I'm really amazed and proud of the farmers and ranchers who are out there doing it this new way and trying it out and proving that it works. So anywhere at whatever part of this system you've interrupted or we've interrupted, we have to make up for that to get to regenerative and eventually sustainable. And always think about the consequences. So where do we start? Well, we're taught things separately, right? So the plant, we're taught separately from the weather, we're taught separately from the soil, but that's not how it works in real life. We're taught that, basically, so you've got the stem and a flower and leaves, and you've got a root system, but basically soil is just the dirt that's holding all of that in place. And that's really not at all the situation. So we get a little older and they show us the soil triangle. And they say, oh, well, look, this is the soil triangle. This is going to tell you everything about soil. You've got clay, silt, and sand. And everything about soil is right here in this triangle. It's clay, silt, and sand. And really, this is just telling you about texture. It's telling you about the texture that you have right now. And if I showed you this picture of a cow, would it tell you how the cow functions? No. So this soil triangle doesn't tell you anything more about soil than this picture of a cow tells you about how the cow functions. So if I gave you a cow and all you'd seen is this picture of a cow, you would not know what the cow needs to eat. You wouldn't know how the cow eats. You wouldn't know what happens to the cow if it doesn't have water. You wouldn't know how it makes milk or how you get the milk from the cow, etc. It's not about how the cow functions. So the old view is you have physical properties like this soil triangle, and you have chemical properties. And so these are two different chemical tests. There's a saturated paste test and a melic-3 extraction. I'll go a little more into these further on. but basically what these tests are telling you is the potential of the soil. It's telling you about what minerals are there, depending on what process they use to separate it from the soil aggregates. But it's telling you about the potential of soil. So again, not how it functions, just the potential. So we're still missing the function until we get here. So this is actually how soil functions. And you may have seen this drawing before. First time I saw this coming out of a landscape architecture program, we're all about graphics. It's like, oh, I can clean this up. Then I realized this is the cleaned up version. This is really pared down. There is so much going on in soil. It's absolutely mind blowing. And so this sort of starts over on the left side of the screen. You've got the sun powering photosynthesis in the plants. The plants are making sugars, this liquid carbon. They're sending it out through their roots. And that's something we got told. Plants take stuff up from the soil. They don't tell us plants send stuff into the soil. So plants are sending this liquid carbon sugar out into the soil, and it's feeding all of these guys in the soil. So this is a whole system that's within a system within a system. So we've got organic matter, and all of these guys are part of the organic matter. So part of that is plant detritus from the top of the soil that the worms chew up and send down into the soil. Part of it is in the winter when roots pull back a little bit, they don't fall off, they just pull back a little bit, and that organic matter is there to feed other parts of the microbial system. And you've got all of these guys working very well together until you do something to the soil that damages it. So if I were going to add something to this drawing, it would be our large ruminant animal, because our large ruminant animal is walking around and making sure that we have microbes all over the place and that we have great diversity of microbes. I'm not talking 15 species of fungi or 1,000 species of bacteria. I'm talking like diversity that would blow your mind. Diversity is always your best friend, no matter what system you're talking about, whether it's your friendships or your soil. Diversity is the way to go every time. And by the way, I'm not talking about composted cow manure. So when the cow manure comes out of this cow, it's got all of these microbes and it's got some nutrient, but it's really the organic matter and the microbes that are really useful to you. If you put this in a pile and you compost it, a lot of stuff is going to die. It's going to go anaerobic. It's going to be very stinky. It's anaerobic because it's so stinky. Where that animal has left it, where it's grazing, you've got all of these microbes to break it down. And when you have good organic matter in the soil, that acts as a buffer for all sorts of things. So when you get that cow pie, it's not a problem if you have organic matter in the soil. They take care of it. You don't have to get in the middle. And so when you take it away and you compost it, not only have you killed off stuff, but if you're buying composted manure, do you know everything the animal ate before that manure was gathered? If the animal has had wormer, if it's had antibiotics, it's not going to have the microbes in it anyhow. So we've got physical properties, chemical properties, our biology. So we've got what it looks like, what the potential is, and how it functions. And biology will trump the rest every time. David Johnson in New Mexico did a really interesting study where he did a soil test ahead of time. It told him he had no potassium, and he grew the crop anyhow. And when he did a tissue test on the plants later in the season, he had potassium in the leaves. So did his soil test really tell him what was there? It depends on the biology. Focus on the living. If you focus on the living, the rest tends to take care of itself. So why do we want these microbes? Well, this big blue thing in the middle of the screen is a root under a microscope, and it's been dyed. And that blue haze that's around it, that's a cloud of bacteria. So the plant is growing. It needs something. It sends a message down through those root exudates that say, hey, guys, here's a little sugar. Can you get me the mineral I need right now? And that bacteria goes out and mines the mineral, brings it back to the root, goes into the root, swirls around while the plant makes a superoxidate, strips the mineral off the bacteria, puts it up against the wall of the root and shoots it back out on a new root hair to go mine some more stuff. Mind blowing. It's absolutely amazing. And there are two new fields of science that didn't even have names 10 years ago. So this is rhizophagy. The guy up in the right-hand corner there is James White from Rutgers. He and his grad students are doing mind-blowing work and producing these incredible videos of watching all of this stuff happen. Phytophagy is another new area of science. James actually has video of microbes on leaves grabbing nitrogen straight out of the air and bringing it into the plant from the air. And these are not legumes. These are all sorts of different plants. So it's not just legumes that can fix nitrogen for you. There are all kinds of plants that are doing this. But because we never looked at what those microbes were doing, we didn't understand what we were looking at. And this, shoot, I'm not sure you can see the top of this slide, but there are pathogens. So we thought about endophytes as being pathogens for a long time. And so you wanted to kill the pathogen, right? Well, guess what? This endophyte goes into this root, and because the plant is healthy, it actually works symbiotically with the plant. And that endophyte, the endophyte helps the bacteria work with the plant. And the particular bacteria that's going into this root is Pseudomonas. So Pseudomonas is going to go all the way up through the root, through the body of the plant, come out of the underside of the leaf from the stomach, go up into the atmosphere, and it's going to collect together ice particles, bind them all together. As it starts to get heavier and heavier with ice, it's going to move down further in the atmosphere and create precipitation. I couldn't say it. So the Pseudomonas is coming out of the soil, through the plant, through the atmosphere, and making rain. So your soil microbes are directly connected to how much rain you're going to get. And it's absolutely amazing. Different minerals are available to the plant through different microbes. So endomycorrhizae are doing one job, ectomycorrhizae are doing another job. This kind of bacteria brings this, that kind of bacteria brings another thing. So you need this great diversity. It's not just the things that break down organic matter that you need in the soil. They break it down, then what? Well, then their part of that job is finished until they have more plant detritus to break down. So you need all these different kinds of microbes in your soil. And one rule of nature that should never be ignored is that if something is unhealthy, nature wants to kill it off quickly so that something healthy can grow in its place. And so the pest insects and the pest pathogens are there for a reason. Nature developed them for a reason. If you see a pest in your garden, it's telling you something. It's telling you the plant is sending out a signal saying, I'm not quite healthy. Maybe you should eat me to create something better. So you're seeing this, you're seeing the symptom and not the problem. And that's a really important part of it. The soil where you are is most likely damaged. If it was a farm, it was probably damaged by tilling and chemicals. If it, if it used to be a wild area, well, they came in, and most likely you don't live in a tent, but you live in a house if you're on this webinar. And to build that house, they had to dig up the soil and they moved it around and they made a pile and they built your house and they had all this stuff laying around and then they rolled it back over. And especially with the new houses, the clients I have,
Hello.
new houses,
Hello.
it's quite amazing to see. They build the house, they have somebody come in and roll out sod that's been raised on chemicals and they call it good and they walk away. So you most likely have very damaged soil. All of those chemicals are antibiotics. They're sides, they're biocide, they're pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, nematicide. And what you need are probiotics. And what is a probiotic for a soil? Well, there's one, but unless you have these guys wandering through your yard, you're going to have to find another way of getting organic matter and microbes. So you can literally grow your soil. This is one way of getting there. So cover cropping, you may have heard of. You never want to have bare soil. So cover cropping is a way of growing something there that you're not necessarily going to use, but it's doing a job even when it's the middle of winter and it's growing. And we do have things that grow over the winter here. We've got winter wheat, we've got cereal rye, we've got clover. There are things that will grow here. And this woman from Australia was doing a study. She wanted to see if she could build carbon in the soil with a cover crop. So she came up with this mixture of things. She had 16 different species in her cover crop mix. She threw it out on farm fields, recorded the carbon. She got increased carbon just from having the stuff grow in the field. So the next year she thought, so she did a cover crop mix with 32 species and she got twice the carbon. So we think in terms of competition. Well, you can't have two things growing because they're going to compete against each other. Well, there's this thing called quorum sensing. And it's when you have enough of a mix in the things you're growing that those microbes are actually working together. Your photosynthesis rate goes up on your plants, which means they're pulling down more carbon and they're sending it out in root exudates into the soil. They're feeding those microbes. The carbon is embodied in the microbes, and you have that carbon building in your soil. A lot of that carbon is alive. Some of it's dead, but it's all very, very useful as long as you have great diversity.
Hilary, we have a question in the chat about
Yes.
cover crops. So once you grow a cover crop, you might give a few examples of some common cover crops too. Ms. Laura is wondering, is it easy to pull them up so you can plant your seeds?
So there are different ways of doing it. So one thing that you can do, you don't want to kill it chemically because you've just gone backwards. You're just going to oxidize off all the carbon that you built over the winter. And you can have cover crop in your garden even when you're growing your vegetables. So if you have something like cereal rye, you want to cut that before it gets a seed head. So you might just hit it with a string trimmer or something, just so it doesn't get seed heads. If it's right where you want to plant something, we'll pull that plant out, but you don't need to completely weed that out. One way of doing it is you crimp it. So there's a farm in Maine, all of their growing beds are flat, and they just take a board with two people because they're doing acreage. They have a board with two people and they put the board on top of the grass that they grew over the winter and they just smush it down. They just break the stem. That becomes your mulch. So it's there, it's going to feed microbes. It gives you something to again, help feed your microbes while your plant is getting established. And it covers the ground so you don't get a lot of weedy growth. The first year you try this, you may get some really crappy weeds like Bermuda grass or nutsedge. They're horrible. Bermuda grass, you won't kill it with cardboard. It will just go under the cardboard. And if you get your soil really healthy, you'll have really nice deep root systems on it. That was my mistake. The only way to kill Bermuda grass is cover it with black cloth in the middle of summer when it's really hot. Nutsedge I've gotten rid of by stripping it out, but then I also killed it with flame and just getting those. And I'm sorry, I'm going off on this. Let me come back to where we are in the presentation. We can talk more about it afterwards if there's time. But yeah, so cereal rye, winter wheat. There's something, well, clover is another one. I'm blanking on others, but there are some seed companies online. There's Green Cover Seed, and I think there's another one called Go, that if you Google cover crops, Go is more retail oriented, so they're a lot friendlier to call and say, I have a garden, you know, this big. Green Cover Seed tends to be broadacre, so they're not quite as easy for home gardeners to use. But you can look at their website, and actually their catalog has all sorts of really useful information in it. So a couple of ways of getting it. If you were starting in the fall, I'd do a cover crop over the winter, but we're starting in the spring. Definitely you want to keep your soil covered, but how are you going to get your organic matter to add organic matter? Well, commercially made compost is never going to have the microbial community that's what you want. EPA regulates big composters. Here, Missouri Organic had to agree to take meat and milk from stores to get all their produce waste. So EPA makes them take their piles to 180 degrees. And by the time you're at 180 degrees, you've really killed all your good guys. I don't cook meat to 180 degrees. So it's really very dead. And Rodale Institute would agree with that. James Sotillo, one of my mentors, did projects all across the country and outside of the country, and he never found commercially produced compost that was had a sufficient microbial community in it to really get it going. So most likely you're, and yeah, here's a test. And I give the composter credit for doing this test. But as you can see, there are lots of places in here where it says lacking species diversity, low numbers in diversity, low fungal biomass. So they add tons of actinobacteria to break it down. And that breaks it down really well, but that's not what you need for growing. You need some of it, but you need lots of other good guys in there. So you have to find a way of adding microbes. And quite honestly, I have looked at piles that people say, oh, I just throw stuff out there. I don't really take care of it. I don't turn it. I don't do this. I don't water it, etc. I have found so much more microbial life in that than in commercially produced compost. And if you get it and it stinks, be really careful. It's going to kill seeds. There have been a lot of problems in the last couple of years with compost that was sent out that was not ready. And you can tell it's not ready because it stinks to high heavens. It's producing a lot of alcohols. And if you put that on a seed, you're going to kill the seed. So let's say you get finished compost from somewhere, it came in a bag, or you got a truckload of it and it doesn't smell bad, so you figure you're okay. It's still not going to have the microbial community you want. So Organic Plant Magic is a product that I can highly recommend. I know the people who produced it. These 3 books at the bottom of the slide are all written by Jeff Lowenfels, a really wonderful guy. These are excellent books that will really get you up. I mean, if you read these books, man, you'll be on top of it. He guided the development of Organic Plant Magic. And so I know that product, so I feel comfortable recommending it. Kingdom Aquaponics is another product you can look for online. Leighton, who developed it, was working at Rodale Institute under Elaine Ingham and James Sotillo, and going home at night and developing his product and then bringing it into the lab the next day for Elaine and James to take a look at. Elaine Ingham, if you haven't heard her name, she is the goddess of microbes. She is the first person I started taking classes with, and I'm getting my certification now through her for the soil food web. And I make a compost tea. I will plug my own product. I make sure it's very diverse. And I look at it under the microscope before I pull out of the driveway. It's over 60% carbon, and most of that carbon is alive. I can't put it in a bottle. It will go anaerobic very quickly. So when I bring it to you, I've still got the air pumps on it. I have to pump air through it constantly to keep it alive because there's just so much stuff alive in it. Anyhow, there are different ways of doing this. There's Masanobu Fukuoka is a guy, wrote a book called One Straw Revolution. One of the things that he did, a lot of people try, is you boil up some rice, you put it in a box, you put it out in the woods somewhere where it's not going to get hit by all the biocides, and you see what grows on it. So you've made a mother culture out of that and then use that as your microbial inoculant. I have a couple of growers here in town who've tried it and haven't had great success with it. I can't tell you exactly why. Maybe it just needed to be tweaked a little bit, but there are different ways of getting there. And these are just a few examples. I won't stay on this slide for very long, but I talked about how one seed corn kills 164,000 bees. This is a study where 70% of the deer that they looked at had genital deformities and jaw deformities from neonics. The neonics were still in their bodies. I won't stay on that slide. But we're trained as consumers. So the minute you go out to buy some compost, somebody's going to try to sell you a mineral amendment. So let me take a minute to look at these 2 slides, and I forgot to turn my timer on. So wave at me, Leslie, if I'm running over time. But so
we have about 10 minutes. So if we could speed through this and maybe have just a few minutes for questions.
Sure, absolutely. So before you add any mineral amendment, you want to get a test. And it doesn't matter what's water soluble, which is the pink test. You want this MELIC3 extraction, and you can contact me if you want more information on it. This is why you don't want to just add stuff. If you have an overabundance of any mineral in one quadrangle, you will be missing something else. We have tons of calcium in our soil, so you are likely to be missing one of the other major cations. If all you do is add, if you try to solve, say, pH, and so somebody tells you, well, put sulfur in to fix pH. Well, okay, sulfur is an anion, maybe that's going to balance, but what about boron and selenium and molybdenum? Those are also other anions that you're probably really low on. So now you've added sulfur, so now you may be missing potassium because you added a bunch of sulfur and it wasn't what you were missing. So you can get really, really out of balance. Let's see. The minute you till, you're causing damage. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. You don't ever need to buy nitrogen. And the minute you till, like you run a rototiller and use it, that ammonium nitrate that is in the soil that your plants pulled down gets turned into NO3, which is a super pollutant. It oxidizes into the atmosphere. It's a super pollutant. You're actually making climate change worse. So please don't till. I know you may have to strip sod. You may find some other way of getting rid of the sod, but don't till. And that also really stresses the plant when it's got to take that NO3 and turn it into NH4, which is the form it needs. Nutrient density, you're only going to get, if you're raising food, you're only going to get it from the microbes in the soil. So you really want to have a good microbial community. If you see pests, it's telling you something about your soil. So this basil on the right is about 10, 15 feet from the cherry tree that's in the background there at the top of the other slide. I had no pests in the garden where I was growing because I had balanced the microbes and I had just pulled down a number of plants. So you're seeing some bare ground there. The cherry, oh, darn it, I don't have that picture. The cherry tree was chewed to bits because I haven't taken care of the soil on that side of the yard the way I've taken care of this soil where my veggie garden was. And so there were literally grasshoppers lined up on one branch of the cherry tree, just taking their turn chewing the daylights out of it. I would see Japanese beetles land inside the garden. They would take a bite. They can't digest it, so they fly off somewhere else. There's no silver bullet, but these are the things you want to balance: your organic matter, possibly mineral amendments if you need them, and the biological. Plants are cool, bare ground is not. Leaf temperature, this is one morning at 72 degrees out. The leaf temperature was just under 60 degrees. The bare soil temperature was almost 140. That reflects back into the atmosphere. That's why you never keep your ground covered, or bare rather. If you keep it covered, then you've got leaves at different heights. When carbon respires back out of the soil, those leaves are going to capture it and send it back through the system. Bioethically, context is important. If it didn't happen here, why are you trying to make it happen here? 40% of our weather is from local conditions, and that small water cycle is massive. This is how we stabilize our weather so that we can continue to grow food beyond the climate crisis. So that's me. So questions?
So Hilary, can you give us sort of a brief step-by-step, like just high level, how to make your soil healthy? Like just step 1, step 2, step 3.
Right. Step 1, top dress with organic matter. Even if you haven't done a test, I can almost guarantee you need more organic matter in your soil. Either make your compost or buy your compost, but get some compost on it. Number 2, find a way of getting your microbes back. Either buy a product or experiment with a mother culture and get your microbes that way. You're surrounded by monoculture farms. You're not getting good microbes on the wind. I can guarantee. You're getting pathogens more than anything else. So you're probably going to have to do something to boost your good guys.
And so would you recommend one of those soil tests then so that you can figure out a bit what you might need?
So the chemistry test is only going to tell you about chemicals. You can use something called a microbiometer. There is a citizen science consortium. If you're familiar with Gibbs Road Farm or Sankara Farm, they are part of it. They will be getting microbiometer tests. I have a microbiometer. It's not expensive to do. You can purchase a microbiometer. It's about, you can get 10 tests for about $115, I think. It's not going to be as detailed as a soil food web test, but a soil food web test is expensive. It's about $150. Oh, there's one way to tell. Take a pair of underpants, like men's tighty whities, bury them in the ground, pick them up 3 months later and see how much is left. If they aren't seriously chewed on, you don't have a good microbial community.
Well, that sounds like an easy test.
That's a really easy one that costs you a pair of underwear.
Okay, so we only have 3 minutes, but does anyone have a question? We will send this out following the webinar so that you can have it to refer back to those books and the other products. So Karen asks, when can you use Magic Garden? Like at what point?
Oh, organic plant magic, anytime. Absolutely anytime. And there are recommendations on the back. I would go at the heavier end to jumpstart it, and make sure you have organic matter in your soil, so you're not wasting any microbes.
Okay, and then Lisa asks, would you recommend getting worms for your compost?
So red wigglers do dig through compost really quickly. The problem is they're invasive here. And it's very hard to see. You won't see the eggs. And so there are a couple of ways of doing worms. So you can do just worm castings if you have a horizontal system. Anytime you get worm castings, add some water to them, watch them. It's 3 weeks for worm eggs to hatch. So if there are worm eggs in the worm castings, you won't know for 3 weeks. It's really a drag, but I mean, that could be a good reason for having a composter, so that you would have it in something separate from soil. Then you could take your compost out and have it, or leave it in there and wait 3 weeks to make sure you don't get any worms hatching in it.
Okay.
But yeah, red wigglers are problematic.
Okay. All right. And then one last question from Toby. Does homemade compost add microbes in addition to organic matter?
Yes. If you put organic waste into it, you'll get better stuff out of it. You don't have to use organic waste to put in it. You can also drive out into the middle of nowhere, not in the middle of a farm field, but go to a forest somewhere, go on a float trip. Without doing damage, bring back a little soil, throw it in your compost pile. If there are ways of getting you can be a microbe wrangler, just don't damage the system that you're going to.
All right. Well, we are at time. I want to thank Hilary so much for that really informative presentation. I think it's a lot more complicated than we think, to get nature back to where she intended us to be. So thank you, Hilary, and thank you everyone for coming to today's webinar. And again, I will send out the recording and get the presentation from Hilary so we can have that for your reference in the future. And happy growing, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.